What led members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints to slaughter around 100 innocent men, women, and children on September 11th, 1857? The Mountain Meadows Massacre is in many ways one of the darkest days in Mormon history. It's also something that's gained a lot more popular attention, especially in response to the Netflix series American Primeval that depicted a very distorted version of what actually happened during that massacre. Spoiler, the massacre was actually worse than what the TV show depicted. But I thought this would provide an opportunity to talk about that event itself, the context for it, what led the immediate instigations for the massacre, the cover-up, and then how several communities came to reckon with that past. This is the history of the Mountain Meadows Massacre and its aftermath. Let's dig in. But first, we need a bit of context, because when members of the Mormon tradition, then following Brigham Young, settled in the Great Basin region, what is now known as Utah, they were doing so by fleeing away from the United States. They had denounced America as a failed experiment that had resulted in the death of their beloved leader, Joseph Smith, and the number of mobs that had pushed them from community to community. They did not want anything to do with America anymore. However, after settling in the Great Basin region in 1857, within a year, came the end of the US-Mexico War, where the United States invaded Mexico, prompting a war, and then at the end, forcing Mexico to concede a lot of Western territories, including the territory that the Mormons were now colonizing, displacing a number of the indigenous communities who lived there. And that once again started this tense relationship between the Latter-day Saint community and its leaders like Brigham Young and the US government, where neither side truly trusted each other. The Mormons wanted full autonomy, and they immediately petitioned for statehood for what they called the State of Deseret. This is what they wanted the boundaries of the State of Deseret to look like, taking in present-day Utah, Nevada, large portions of Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, even down to Southern California, because they wanted to create their own autonomous empire in the West. Of course, the American government did not trust them enough for that, so they peeled back that land, made it a territory of Utah instead, and the tense dance between these two sovereign powers, the Mormons and America, continued for a decade. Every few years, the Mormons would petition for statehood so that they could have control over their area, and the federal government refusing and keeping them as a territory so that the government could control them. Although there were a few concessions, like Brigham Young was allowed to be the territorial governor, and at least for a few years, the government had sided with the Mormons whenever there were federal delegates who chastised and wanted to punish the Latter-day Saints. But all that comes to an end in early 1857. By the way, if you enjoy this type of history, please make sure you are subscribed to my channel. I've done a number of videos on related topics like Joseph Smith's run for the US presidency in 1844. I've talked about the end of polygamy, the central issue that was at the heart of the Mormon-American conflict. And I do other videos throughout the week connecting history to modern day events. And I also provide background reading, assignments for you to learn more about various topics through books and articles. History is so much more relevant now than it ever has been. And so these discussions are important. All right, anyways, back to the history. So in early 1857, Mormons send off one more attempt for getting statehood for Utah. They send a very bombastic petition to the US government, urging them that if you don't give us autonomy, we are going to take action. Receiving that petition was the US President James Buchanan. Here's his portrait here, who was elected just a few months earlier. Now, James Buchanan was obsessed with how to deal with Western territories. The Kansas-Nebraska issue was the driving focus of his administration. But now he worries that there was a move to secede by these Mormons out in the West who are posing a coup to take over their own control and overthrow American sovereignty out there. So James Buchanan denounces the Mormons as in an insurrection and he calls for 2,500 troops to march out to Utah, replace Brigham Young as a territorial governor, replace Brigham Young as the superintendent of Indian Affairs, which was one of the most important political positions, and reassert federal authority. Now, word of this coming federal militia, this is the largest standing army marching out in several years, and word of that encroaching federal power arrives in Utah while the Mormons were celebrating Pioneer Day on July 24th, 1857. And Brigham Young receives that news, and it seems to be a confirmation that there is an endless, unquenchable war between the Mormons and the government. They think back to all these previous moments of persecution, being forced out of New York, out of Ohio, out of Missouri, out of Illinois, out of America itself. And now they felt like this is America sending in a federal army to slaughter the saints. Adding to this anxiety, around the same time, they get news that one of their most beloved apostles, Parley P. Pratt, was killed by the husband of one of his plural wives. A story maybe for another video. So the Mormons felt under siege. And in response, Brigham Young makes three major declarations which frame the coming months and importantly give a foundation for the massacre. First, he declares martial law, saying that that we are not going to cooperate with the federal government. We're not even going to help the migrant trains coming through. We are going to take care of our own. We are at war. Second, he and his followers deliver a series of fiery sermons that tinge the earth around Utah, causing up this growing fear and distrust of this coming army. And third, in his position as superintendent of Indian Affairs, he tells the government that I'm no longer going to hold the Indians back from attacking the migrants, that he presents this image that the only things that have been keeping these Native Americans in check in the region is us Mormons have been holding them in their place. This is a good point to talk about, or at least touch on, the complex relations between Mormons and the indigenous nations. Remember, by the Mormons settling in this region, they are displacing a lot of native communities that had called that area home for generations. Mormons acted as colonizers, even as they tried to form some form of a paternalistic coordination with them, especially since they had a common enemy. And this played into these national narratives of the Mormons and the Indians teaming up against Native Americans. Here you have one political cartoon from the time showing Brigham Young joining with the Native Americans in fighting against Uncle Sam. This, of course, is a complicated story because Mormons themselves were perpetuating violence against the Native Americans, including places like the Provo River Massacre, where Mormons killed over 100 Timpanogos people and enslaved many others. So all of that gives context to where in 1857, in the months following Brigham Young's declarations, there are these migrant trains coming through from the east to California. Now, I'm going to be talking about this book a bit later, but in the book Vengeance is Mine by Rick Turley and Barbara Jones Brown, a phenomenal history of this massacre, they are able to document at least 7 skirmishes that take place between Mormons and these migrant trains, often framed as Native Americans attacking them when it was really Mormons, to fulfill this Mormon myth that we were the ones holding back the Native Americans. And Brigham Young himself was actually now urging Native Americans to raid these trains, even though it often turns out to be Mormons who are raiding them, fitting into these racist stereotypes of who are the quote-unquote savages on the frontier. So all of this is laying the foundation for the arrival of the Fancher Party in September of that year. So the Fancher migrant train, known after the Fanchers, who were the primary drivers, were coming through largely from Arkansas, although there were people from different states who had joined their camp while they were crossing across the West. They were comparatively wealthy compared to some other camps, and it is likely that the Mormons were pretty jealous of the goods and the horses and the livestock that this camp possessed. There were skirmishes between Latter-day Saints and the Fancher Party as they were making their way south from the Salt Lake region down to the southwest corner of Utah. At one point, the Mormons accused the Fancher train of poisoning the livestock, an untrue accusation. It was actually probably anthrax. There's been a lot of scientific study into this. And further, they start accusing the Fanchers of these grandiose, fraudulent accusations, like they were the ones that they were boasting that they had killed Parley P. Pratt. Remember, Parley P. Pratt was killed in Arkansas just earlier this summer. Some claim that that the Fancher Party were boasting that they had killed Joseph Smith and they were carrying the gun that did the final blow. All of these things that would later be used to justify the indefensible. The original attack probably took place because the Mormons wanted to teach them a lesson once they reached the Mountain Meadows. Here's an early depiction of what the Mountain Meadows looked like. Trying to teach them a lesson of messing with the Mormons, and further, so they can perpetuate this idea that the Native Americans were assaulting migrants now that the Mormons weren't holding them back. But something happened during that skirmish which fit into a larger pattern. At one point, the Mormons were unveiled as being the ones initiating the attack and not Native Americans. So now Mormons were faced with the dilemma because this Fancher Party realized that it was the Mormons, not the Native Americans, who are attacking these migrant camps. And once they make it to California, their desired destination, they would spread that news abroad, especially to the military camps that are out in California, and they will start marching to Utah, and the other militia that is on their way from James Buchanan, Washington, D.C. will come, and the Mormons will be surrounded, they will be attacked. This was a siege mentality for the Mormons. They felt that it was do or die. And so, led by some local leaders like John D. Lee, who was a local ecclesiastical and militia leader, as well as Isaac Haight, who was a stake president and head of the Nauvoo Legion for the region, their militia, they are merging both political and ecclesiastical authoritative positions, and they start making decisions. They send a runner up to Salt Lake City to ask Brigham Young for what to do now that the Fancher camp is surrounding their wagons to try to hold in for a siege, waiting for further attacks. And eventually, before they get a response from Brigham Young, John D. Lee and Isaac Haight go against a local council decision that they decided we'll just let them go. They say that, no, we have to take action. And so they made the grave conclusion, probably around September 10th of 1857, that every single member of that migrant chain, except for those who are too young to tell tales, had to be killed. The grisly massacre then took place the next day, September 11th. John D. Lee, acting as the local militia leader, marches into the Fancher camp that, remember, they have circled their wagons and they're trying to hold off any fights. John D. Lee tells them the myth that it's the Native Americans, the Southern Paiute, who are attacking them, but they've made an agreement that if you follow these orders, we will be able to march you to safety. They line up the Fancher Party in a series of groups. You have the men lining up in a straight line. They all had to give up their guns and their protections. Next to each of those Fancher Migrant Party men would be a Mormon militiaman holding a gun. They would be marching out in a single file. There would be then a space, and then there would be the women and the children marching in a single file line. And then well behind them would be the old and the decrepit and those who are disabled being carried in a wagon. At a designated point, a signal was given, and all the Mormon militiamen would turn to their designated migrant, and they shot them and killed them in cold blood, only sparing about 17 children who they deemed were, again, the words, too young to tell tales. Now, it is impossible to overstate the grisly nature of this massacre. I try to give background and context for why the Mormons are doing this. They felt they were at war. They thought back to all the persecution that had been inflicted on them. None of that justifies the horrors of that day of September 11th, 1857. So I don't want any of this contextualization to be given as a defense. A second point I want to make about this is there's long been disputed the role of Native Americans on this massacre. There's a lot of reports from Mormons or contemporary and otherwise that there was some involvement from Southern Paiute. but any involvement from them should be interpreted as coerced, that the Mormons were, bullying the Southern Paiutes that were often at the bottom of these hierarchical chains in the region. And further, Paiute have long denied that they participated. So this should be seen as primarily a Mormon massacre. The 17 children who were spared were then divvied up to a number of local Mormon families, and they felt that they would be able to go on with nothing changing. Let's talk about the cover-up, and particularly the question of Brigham Young's culpability, because this is often raised. You might remember I mentioned that the local council sent a runner up to Salt Lake City to ask Brigham Young what to do after the initial attack on the Fancher Party. That reply arrived shortly after the massacre, Brigham Young saying, "Let them go." Now, there are some scholars that say that that was a decoy, that in reality, Brigham Young had ordered the massacre days before. This is a complicated matter, and I don't want to go too much in depth, but I'll just say this. It's a general scholarly consensus that the broad majority of scholars who have looked over all their primary sources agree for a number of reasons that Brigham Young likely did not give approval to the massacre that took place. The countering argument usually revolves around a point where, of course, they wouldn't do something like this without Brigham Young's approval. That's just a belief. It's not an evidence-based position. It seems like Brigham Young recognized that slaughtering this migrant train was only going to bring more repercussions on the region. With that said, Brigham Young certainly was complicit in creating the atmosphere that made the massacre possible in the first place. He's the one that declared martial law. He's the one that started the fiery sermons that escalated this us versus them mentality. He's the one that cultivated this idea of Indian raids on the migrant trains that prompted and then justified the massacre. We can also see if you dig into the precise records, there seems to be a shift where at first John D. Lee and others are boasting about their activity, but as soon as it comes back from Brigham Young that he was not in support of a massacre, they started changing their stories and spreading lies and myths about that the migrants were asking for it. They were the ones who had killed Parley Pratt or had helped kill Joseph Smith or had poisoned the livestock. They argued that it was the Native Americans who perpetuated the massacre in the first place. And that was a myth that remained long within Mormon and Utah cultural memory. Brigham Young is also complicit in a cover-up that then takes place. I think the most simple way to say it is that Brigham Young chose not to dig deeper into the story that was told to him. And then when he started learning lessons, he didn't start acting on them until later. Remember, the Mormons were at war. There was a coming army, a federal army. And so he interpreted that, all these events in that context. And so he chose not to dig deeper into the atrocity and buying the lies that John D. Lee and Isaac Haight and others told. It wasn't until over a decade later that Brigham Young actually started investigating and gathering details, and that resulted in John D. Lee, Isaac Haight, and others being excommunicated around 1870. And then it was during that decade that there was finally enough judicial systems in place and the right people pushing the convictions that there were arrest warrants sent out for some of the leading conspirators, although John D. Lee was the only one that was captured, and he remained the only person who was convicted of the crimes performed at Mountain Meadows Massacre. Here you have an image from the day he was executed. And in one of the only occasions in American history, there might be other occasions that I'm not aware of, but this was one of the only occasions where he was returned to the point of the crime, Mountain Meadows, where he was then shot, put in the casket, and then taken to where he was buried. And then that story was largely buried with him. And Mormons largely told the tale that it was the Native Americans blaming the Paiute for the atrocity that they did. It wasn't until the historian Juanita Brooks, a descendant of some of the perpetrators of the massacre, who dug into the history and wrote the book Mountain Meadows Massacre, initially published by Stanford University Press, which is arguably one of the most important Mormon history books written, the start of a scholarly Mormon history trend. It also caused her to be ostracized by many in the community for spreading gossip and telling lies about their ancestors. And then it wasn't until the 21st century that the LDS Church started reckoning with that history. After a number of historians like Will Bagley published their books showing that the Mormon myth that it was Native Americans was false, that the LDS Church commissioned 3 historians, Ronald Walker, Richard Turley, and Glenn Leonard, to write a book, Massacre at Mountain Meadows, that was published around the 150th anniversary of the massacre. And it is in many ways the definitive record because they granted them access to that no other historians were able to access before. And then around that same time, at the 150th commemoration, Henry B. Eyring, a member of the LDS First Presidency, issued a statement of profound regret of the church's involvement, which is about as close the church has ever come for an apology. One of the examples of what I believe is a poignant cultural work of reconciliation we've seen in recent years is this. It's a quilt that was put together by descendants of the massacre, descendants of the perpetrators, and a number of scholars and other community members who have come together. There has been a vibrant, rewarding, and profound dialogue that has taken place among these different groups, and to a great degree, a lot of reconciliation. I was very privileged to take a tour to Mountain Meadows Massacre last year that involved people from all these different camps: the perpetrators, the victims, and the scholars, and all their descendants, being able to learn from their perspectives and being able to come together. And it shows us the power of an actual honest historical accounting can actually do. So there's a lot more complexities to this. I could have made this a 2-hour-long video and still just scratch the surface, especially in the aftermath. But a few points of reading suggestions if you want to learn more. One of the authors who wrote that Massacre at Mountain Meadows book, Richard Turley, then teamed up with Barbara Jones Brown. So 2 amazing historians, and they wrote Vengeance is Mine, the Mountain Meadows Massacre and its Aftermath, published by Oxford University Press a couple of years ago. This is in many ways the definitive book on the massacre and the aftermath, including how the number of perpetrators were brought to justice, or at least John D. Lee. And then if you want the broader cultural meaning, I strongly recommend Janice Johnson's Convicting the Mormons, the Mountain Meadows Massacre in American History, published by the University of North Carolina Press, which really demonstrates how this has been a potent symbol in American culture. So there you have it. Please let me know what I missed in this history. Like I said, it's very layered, it's very complicated. There's so much to actually cover. And please like and share this video so we can have a good discussion surrounding these topics. History has never been more relevant than it is now, and so these discussions are important.